Pull up a map of Africa and take a close look at it. Now compare it to a map of Europe. Europe's borders wander. They follow rivers, hug mountain ranges, curl around centuries of wars and treaties and marriages between royal houses. But many of Africa's borders do something unusual. They run ruler straight. Look at the line between Egypt and Sudan. Dead straight for hundreds of kilometers. Look at Namibia's strange narrow Caprivi Strip, reaching out like a finger toward the Zambezi River. Look at the borders slicing through the Sahara between Libya, Niger, Chad, and Algeria. 4 countries with almost no curves between them. That's not geography. Rivers don't run in straight lines, and mountain ranges don't either. So what does? People with rulers and a map and almost no idea or interest in what was actually on the ground. Today, we're tracing exactly how that happened and why the decisions made in one European city over about 90 days in the winter of 1884 and 1885 are still shaping the borders and the conflicts of an entire continent. Hey, I'm Michael and welcome to Hoodie History. Today we're going back to a conference room in Berlin in the winter of 1884 where 14 nations carved up a continent they barely understood and never invited anyone who actually lived there. If you're the kind of person who wants to understand not just what happened in history, but why the world looks the way it does today, hit subscribe. That's exactly what I explore here. And between episodes, the Hoodie History newsletter goes even deeper. It's free and you can sign up at hoodiehistory.com or see the link in the description below. By the 1880s, Europe had been nibbling at Africa's coastline for centuries. Trading posts, forts, mission stations, but the interior remained, to European eyes, largely unmapped and unclaimed. But that was changing fast. The growing use of quinine as a preventative, not just a cure, made survival in malarial regions possible for Europeans in numbers that hadn't existed before. Steamships could now push up rivers that used to stop explorers dead, and the Industrial Revolution had created a hunger for raw materials, like rubber, palm oil, cotton, and minerals, that Africa had in abundance. Meanwhile, Africa itself was not an empty continent waiting to be filled in. It held ancient kingdoms and empires. The Sokoto Caliphate across what's now northern Nigeria, the Kingdom of Congo, the Buganda Kingdom near Lake Victoria, the Ashanti Empire on the Gold Coast, along with thousands of smaller polities, chiefdoms, and trading networks, each with its own borders, alliances, and rivalries, built up over centuries. But European powers were now racing each other for territory, and the risk of that race turning into a war between European nations over African land was real. King Leopold II of Belgium had already been quietly building a personal claim to the Congo Basin through a private organization. His tool of choice was the Welsh-born explorer Henry Morton Stanley, already famous for his earlier search for the missionary David Livingstone. Between 1879 and 1884, working for Leopold's International African Association, Stanley pushed up the Congo River and signed hundreds of treaties with local chiefs, many of whom had little understanding of what they were agreeing to, or that they were signing away sovereignty in the European legal sense at all. France was pushing inland from Senegal, Britain held Egypt and the Cape, Germany, newly unified under Otto von Bismarck, wanted colonies of its own, partly for resources and partly for the prestige of being a great power. Bismarck saw an opportunity, and not, historians agree, a purely charitable one. Hosting a conference let him drive a wedge between Britain and France, force the other powers to formally recognize Germany's arrival as a colonial player, and shore up his own political standing at home. Preventing a war over Africa suited him, but so did being the man in the room who got to write the rules. On the 15th of November 1884, delegates from 14 nations arrived at Bismarck's official residence on Wilhelmstrasse in Berlin. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, Austria-Hungary, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and the United States all sent representatives. Not a single African ruler, chief, or representative was invited, and not a single African voice was in that room. The conference wasn't really about Africa at all, not in the sense of understanding it. It was about Europe managing itself. The central problem Bismarck wanted solved was this: how do you stop rival European powers going to war over African territory, while making sure Germany came out of it recognized as a great power in its own right? His answer, and the answer the delegates settled on, became the General Act of Berlin, signed when the conference closed on 26 February 1885, after 93 days of negotiation. Two provisions in that document mattered more than anything else. First, free trade and free navigation were guaranteed along the Congo and Niger rivers. No single power could choke off access. Second, and this is the one that really changes everything, the delegates agreed on the principle of effective occupation. From now on, a European power couldn't simply plant a flag and claim a territory on paper. It had to demonstrate actual physical control, like administration, treaties with local rulers, or military presence, for its claim to be recognized by the other powers. That single rule turned colonization from a slow, opportunistic process into a frantic, competitive one. If you didn't move fast and plant your administrators on the ground, someone else would. Leopold II walked away from Berlin having secured recognition of the Congo Free State, not as a Belgian colony, but as his own personal possession, roughly 76 times the size of Belgium itself. It would go on to become one of the most brutal colonial regimes in modern history, its rubber quotas enforced through forced labor and violence on a scale historians still debate the true extent of today. But the detail that surprises most people is that the delegates in that room in Berlin didn't sit down with rulers and draw the specific lines that would become Africa's national borders. That popular image, colonial men hunched over a map tracing borders with a straight edge in the conference hall itself, is largely a myth. What happened in Berlin was agreement on the rules. What happened to the map occurred afterwards, and it happened over the following 30 years. Then the real carving began. Between 1885 and 1914, in a period historians call the Scramble for Africa, European powers raced across the continent, signing hundreds of separate bilateral treaties with each other. Britain and France here, Germany and Portugal there, dividing territory as they went. And across vast stretches of the continent, particularly the unmapped interior and the Sahara, the easiest, fastest way for two European officers to agree on a line was to draw a straight one. A line of longitude, a line of latitude, a ruler across a blank space on a map, because nobody sitting in London, Paris, or Berlin had walked the ground in between. Take Namibia's Caprivi Strip, that odd, narrow finger of land pointing east towards the Zambezi. It exists because of a single treaty signed in 1890, the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty. Britain ceded the tiny North Sea island of Heligoland to Germany. In exchange, Germany dropped its claims over Zanzibar in favor of Britain, and picked up that narrow corridor toward the Zambezi River instead, hoping it would one day link its colonies in the west with its territory in East Africa. Nobody involved in the negotiation had walked that corridor. It was simply a shape on a map, exchanged like a chess move between two governments that had never set foot there. The result, repeated again and again across the continent, was borders that had nothing to do with the people living inside them. Kingdoms were split down the middle. The Bakongo people ended up divided across French Congo, Belgian Congo, and Portuguese Angola. The Somali people were carved into 5 separate colonial territories. Nomadic and pastoral groups whose entire way of life depended on seasonal movement across vast distances suddenly found their traditional roots crossing international borders that hadn't existed the year before. By 1914, roughly 90% of the African continent was claimed by European empires. Claimed is the operative word. On paper, the map was almost entirely European. On the ground, in vast stretches of the interior, actual colonial administration was thin to non-existent. Only Ethiopia, which had defeated an Italian invasion at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, and Liberia remained formally independent. The lines were drawn, but the people who would eventually have to live inside them for generations had never been asked. For most of the 20th century, those colonial borders simply held, enforced first by European administrations, then remarkably by the very people who had inherited them. Britain's 1914 amalgamation of Nigeria's northern and southern protectorates, for instance, joined a largely Muslim north and a religiously mixed south into a single colonial unit for administrative convenience, a decision whose consequences Nigerians still debate today. When African nations began winning independence through the 1950s and 60s, Ghana in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, and dozens more through that same decade, newly independent leaders faced an agonizing choice: redraw the borders to better reflect Africa's actual ethnic and cultural geography, and risk endless territorial wars between the new states, or keep the colonial lines, however arbitrary, and at least start from a position of stability. This next part is where the story stops being distant history and starts becoming the world you might recognize if you looked at a map today. In 1964, the Organization of African Unity, the forerunner to today's African Union, made its decision. Meeting in Cairo, its members formally agreed to the principle of Uti Possidetis Juris, Latin for as you possess, so you may possess. In plain terms, the colonial borders would stay. It was, in many ways, a pragmatic and defensive choice, designed to prevent the continent tearing itself apart in border wars. But it also meant that lines drawn by 14 nations in Berlin, none of them African, became the permanent skeleton of the modern African state system. Those borders didn't just survive, they shaped what came after. Nations built from arbitrary colonial territories often contained dozens of ethnic and linguistic groups with no shared history of governing together, while other groups that did share deep historical, cultural, or linguistic ties found themselves split across 2 or 3 different countries, with different colonial languages, legal systems, and currencies. Scholars still actively debate exactly how much weight to place on colonial borders as a cause of Africa's post-independence conflicts, alongside other major factors like Cold War proxy politics, resource competition, and the specific choices made by post-independence governments. But few historians dispute that the borders themselves made the task of nation-building dramatically harder than it otherwise might have been. What strikes me about this story isn't really the 90 days in Berlin, it's the 30 years that followed, when nobody with any power thought to change the approach. The conference set a rule: effective occupation, prove you control it, and everyone just kept following that rule, treaty after treaty, straight line after straight line, for a generation. Nobody stopped to ask what it would actually mean decades later for a border to run straight through a kingdom. And the thing that I come back to is how ordinary the decision-making probably felt to the people involved. I doubt many of those men saw themselves as reshaping the fate of a continent for the next century and beyond. They were focused on solving an immediate practical problem. How do we divide this without going to war with each other? With the tools they had, like maps, rulers, and treaties written in offices thousands of kilometers from the people and places being described. It wasn't only ambition that built these borders, though there was plenty of that in how the resulting colonies were run. It was also the kind of careless, bureaucratic indifference. Nobody in that room needed to be malicious to draw a line through the middle of a nation. They just needed to not think about the people who had been living there for countless generations. So next time you look at a map of Africa, you can remember that those straight lines aren't a geographic accident. They're a decision made in a room in Berlin in 1884 and 1885 by 14 nations who never set foot in the places they were dividing. Then completed over the following 30 years by colonial officials with rulers and incomplete maps. And when African nations gained independence, they inherited those lines almost entirely intact. Not because the lines made sense, but because the alternative seemed even more dangerous. That's the direct line from a conference room on Wilhelmstrasse to the shape of the modern African continent. The Berlin Conference didn't build every border in Africa. Some do follow rivers and some follow older kingdoms' boundaries, but it set the rules of a race that drew many of the straight ones. And it's a race whose finish line African nations are, in many ways, still impacted by. So I'll leave you with this. Do you think those borders should have been redrawn after independence, even at the risk of conflict? And looking at a map of your own country's borders, how much of their shape do you think came from geography, and how much came from decisions made in rooms that few ever saw? So that's the story of how Africa's borders look the way they do, and in some ways, once you know it, it's hard to look at a map the same way again. Thanks for being here. If this story made you rethink the map, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear which border surprised you most, or if there's a story about a border from your part of the world that I should explore. And if you haven't already, that thumbs up genuinely helps my channel find more people. If you're new here, hit subscribe. I publish new videos regularly, tracing the origin of something you live with right now, back to the moment when it was made. You can find me on Instagram and TikTok at Hoodie History. I publish short history videos there regularly. You can also watch my short videos on my YouTube Shorts channel at Hoodie History Shorts. And if you want to go even deeper, I've also written history ebooks that are available now. You'll find links to all these in the description. And lastly, I explore more details and stories in the Hoodie History newsletter. You can sign up for free at hoodiehistory.com or hit the link in the description. Thanks again for watching or listening. If you're not already subscribed, hit the button now so you don't miss what's coming next. See you next time.